Last week, I mentioned that the first types of criminological theory were theological in nature. The idea was that criminals committed crime because it was God's will, God made them that way. Related ideas were demonological. People committed crimes because they were possessed by the devil or possessed by a demon. Beginning in the 1700s, we see the emergence of what today is known as the classical theories, which which assume that human beings have free will and that they choose to engage in crime and deviance. And so we began this unit by reading uh, the Italian philosopher Cesare Beccaria, whose ideas have been extremely influential. I'm sure that you saw parallels between Beccaria's ideas and things that we have in the United States criminal justice system today, based on him. For example, Beccaria argued that laws should be created by legislators, but that legislators should not judge defendants. There should be a separation between the people who create the laws and the people who administer the laws. And we see that today in our system. There's a distinction between the legislators and the judges. Beccaria's idea was that offenders should be judged by their peers, and that's the whole idea behind our jury system, derives directly from that argument. Beccaria argued that the offender should have the right to reject some jurors if he thought they might be biased. There should be no secret accusations by the government. Everything should be done out in the open. Judges should be impartial seekers of truth. Judges should not be part of the state treasury. They should not be able to profit from judging criminals. Beccaria argued that the accused should have certain rights. He argued that the law should forbid leading questions or suggestive questions at trial, and we still see this idea in our rules of procedure in criminal trials today. Certain types of questioning are disallowed. Beccaria argued against torture to receive a confession. He argued that confessions made under torture were not reliable. One of Beccaria's main arguments was that punishments should be swift, prompt, and certain. To be effective deterrence, you had to be pretty confident that you would be caught and punished pretty quickly. And this still exists in the neoclassical school today. So we're going to move from Beccaria into more modern theorists working in the same vein, the rational choice theorists. The idea behind rational choice theory is that people choose to commit crimes based on a rational consideration of costs and benefits. So the assumptions here are that people are rational, they're pursuing their own interests, they're trying to maximize their pleasure and minimize their pain, and that they will engage in crime if they believe it's to their advantage overall. From this, we get deterrence theory. Deterrence theory is the idea that if punishments are certain enough that people will be deterred from engaging in crime, they'll make a rational calculation that it's not in their best interest to commit that crime. So the existence of punishments will deter crime. And this idea comes down to us from Beccaria and remains with us today in contemporary rational choice approaches to criminology. And it's had a huge policy impact on contemporary crime control policies, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The U.S. criminal justice system has largely abandoned rehabilitation, not totally abandoned rehabilitation, but over the past half century, we've removed a lot of the rehabilitative aspects of our criminal justice system, of our correction system, and we're moving more and more towards deterrence. We're focusing on increasing the certainty and the severity of punishment, as Beccaria argues will work. So examples of that might be three strikes laws. The idea is if you get your third felony, you are guaranteed life in prison. That's a three strikes law. Another example of this would be juvenile waivers, increasing the severity of punishment. A juvenile waiver is when a juvenile offender is tried in an adult court, increasing the potential severity of punishment. So these are policies built in the idea of deterrence. And hopefully you remember from Intro to Criminal Justice the two types of deterrence: specific deterrence and general deterrence. Specific deterrence is the idea that if I punish you, that you specifically will be deterred from committing that crime in the future. General deterrence means that if I punish you, the other people will see me punishing you, and they will be deterred by viewing your punishment. Okay, so basic stuff. That's more or less review those definitions, and the distinction between those two types of deterrence is interrogated by the second author that I assigned you to read this week. Now, do policies rooted in deterrence work well to reduce crime? Yes and no. It depends. It might work for some people, not for others. Some studies have found that imposing more severe punishments might actually increase the likelihood of subsequent crime. Research has shown that increasing the swiftness of punishment does not really reduce subsequent offending. Results of these studies are mixed. The problem is, to do a really good experiment, a gold standard experiment, we would need to have one group of criminals who were caught and punished, and another group of criminals who were not caught and were not punished. And we need to compare the relative recidivism rates of those two groups, the rates of subsequent offending. This is extremely challenging research to do, and so we don't have the last word on whether deterrence works. It's clear that it does not always work the way that policymakers intend it to work. In fact, there are some indications that people who are punished actually have higher rates of recidivism. By being sent to prison, they learn to become better criminals. They are socialized by the people the people are hanging out with in prison to be more criminal. Having a criminal record makes it more difficult for you to lead a straight life, and so that in itself might lead you to recidivate once you are released. So there's a host of reasons why more swift and certain punishment, a more severe punishment, does not always function to reduce subsequent offending. In other words, it doesn't always function as a deterrent. Which brings us to the arguments of the rational choice people, who argue that people are rational and they will calculate the cost and benefits before they commit an offense. This certainly holds true for some offenders, but for many it does not. Many offenders are simply not functioning rationally. Many offenders may not be that rational because they have limited cognitive capacity. In other words, they're not very smart, but they're not able to think or understand the consequences of their actions. Many criminals, even intelligent criminals, might be highly impulsive in acting on the basis of emotion rather than rational cost-benefit analyses. Many people who commit crimes, especially violent crimes, are functioning purely out of emotion. They're angry. They get in a fight in a bar and they commit a violent crime because they're angry, or they're jealous about what their partner is doing. Jealousy, anger can lead you to function emotionally instead of making a rational decision. Also, the effects of drugs, alcohol, and mental illness can reduce your capacity for rational cost-benefit calculations. So for these reasons, deterrence policies rooted in rational choice assumptions very often fail to accomplish what they set out to do. Increasing the certainty of punishment may reduce a moderate amount of crime, and perhaps that's okay. But again, if we are rational policymakers, we have to consider the cost benefits. Is it worth $1 billion to reduce crime by 5%? Well, if we have a city of 100,000 people, $1 billion is a lot of money. To reduce crime 5%, it's probably not worth it. On the other hand, if the federal government could reduce crime across the entire country for $1 billion, that would probably be a bargain. 5% reduction in crime for $1 billion, yeah, I'd take that across the country. I would not take it for my city. Even if these policies have a small amount of success, we need to compare that success with the costs, and not just the financial costs, but the human costs as well. Research shows that changes in the level of the severity of punishment have little to no effect on crime. In other words, punishing people more harshly does not deter crime. Again, primarily because most criminals are not thinking that rationally when they decide to commit the crime. When the certainty of punishment does reduce crime, that reduction is often short-lived and restricted to a specific area. So for example, if we flood a neighborhood with police officers, there's a higher level of certainty that you will be caught. But that, as I just said, that deterrence usually only lasts as long as the police sweep is in action and it's confined to that specific neighborhood. It's not an effective program for the long term. So I am not rejecting rational choice theory out of hand. Clearly, some offenders are thinking rationally. They are engaged in cost-benefit analyses, and these are the people who are most likely to be affected by crime control policies. And so crime control policies can be effective deterrents for a certain fraction of offenders, but certainly not all offenders. Many of our crime control policies are based in the assumption that people are rational. And let me just give you one example. Politicians who are interested in crime reduction often advocate for increased spending on police departments or putting more police on the street. And they'll try to give more money to police departments. Does this work? Well, first of all, when we give more money to police departments, how do we know that that money is actually going to go to hiring more officers? It may just lead to increasing salaries for existing officers or purchases of equipment or other expenditures. So for it to have any chance at deterrence, first we have to ensure that it goes towards hiring more officers. Now, if more police officers are hired, does that mean there's going to be more police officers on the street? Perhaps some of those people will be working in administrative functions that do not have a deterrent capacity. Finally, what if we do successfully increase the number of officers on the street? Will that have a deterrent effect on crime? Think about how often you see a police officer in your neighborhood. In my neighborhood, I see a police officer once or twice a year. You could double the patrols in my neighborhood and I would barely even notice. What if I lived on a street where I saw a police officer once a day and you doubled the amount of patrols? Well, now I see a police officer twice a day. Is that enough to really deter me from doing a crime if I see the cop only twice a day? It might take a whole lot more police officers to really create the deterrent effect. Because if the offenders really are rational, they're going to notice, first they have to notice that there's more officers on the street. And second, they have to fear the consequences of those added officers. Really increasing the number of officers most often does not reduce crime very much at all. It's not really a cost-effective way of crime control.